Okay, welcome back, everyone, to BDA Baby, Before, During, and After Baby. I am the host, Katherine Schwarzenegger. This is my first recording back in 2025. It's also my first recording back after having my son in November. We're now in the first week of February, and to say that it has been a wild couple months is an understatement. I love the BDA Baby community, and I rely on all of you so much, and also love getting all of your questions and feedback. So this topic that we're covering today is not one that I anticipated ever really covering or talking about, and certainly not as my first episode back. But we are here today to talk about wildfire smoke and how that impacts adults, children, newborns, pregnant people, those with asthma. And we're doing this because of the recent fires in the Los Angeles area. For me personally, the Pacific Palisades fire, I am born and raised in Pacific Palisades. We evacuated, my whole family evacuated, all my family members evacuated. So this is a subject that hits close to home for me and is one that we are dealing with in real time. There has been so much collateral damage that has come from this event in January and is ongoing. And so many of us are trying to find our way in this new normal as we have been given. And so many of our loved ones have lost their homes, have lost everything. We had our home there, and our home is still standing. And I say that with a heavy heart because so many around us have lost so much. And we are navigating remediation as our home was in a very major part of the fire zone. And it's been a wild time. And we have our kids. We are still not back home. Don't know what that will look like. But I wanted to have this conversation because I myself have so many questions about life back in Los Angeles and in our new area, not being in the Palisades for the first time in a very long time. And I know that there are so many other moms, and just whether you're a parent or not a parent, who are trying to navigate what to do about the air quality in Los Angeles. There have been seminars about air quality in Los Angeles, and it still seems that so many of us are left with the questions of, is the air safe? Is it safe for me to go outside, for my kids to go outside? Is it safe to resume life as normal if you weren't impacted by your home being in the Palisades? And what does it mean to be in a surrounding area from a burn zone? So we're going to tackle all those questions today and hopefully get to the bottom of some of them. I am lucky enough to be able to interview today two experts in the space. One is Joe Allen. He's the director of the Healthy Buildings program at Harvard University. And we're also going to be talking to Lindsey Burghardt, who is a pediatrician and Chief Science Officer at the Center of the Developing Child at Harvard University. Both Joe and Lindsey come in with not only their own level of expertise, but also experience studying other fires, other reintegrations, and smoke. And we're just going to launch into all the questions you guys have submitted and just get right into it. So here we go. Welcome, Joe and Lindsey, to BDA Baby. I'm really grateful that both of you have taken the time to come on here and talk to me today about wildfire smoke, air quality, all the things that anyone who is impacted by the latest fires in Los Angeles or fires in general, we are curious about, and we would love answers about so many different topics. And this is a really, really important one to me and to all the people who submitted their questions. So maybe we can start by both of you just introducing yourselves so people can get to know you.
I'm Lindsey Burghardt. I'm a practicing primary care pediatrician in a community outside of Boston, and I'm also the chief science officer at the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard, and the mom of 3 kids.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Joe Allen. I'm an associate professor at the Harvard School of Public Health. I run the Harvard Healthy Buildings program. Been doing forensics around buildings and how to keep people safe in buildings for about 20 years. We just recently did something around wildfires out in Maui. So my heart goes out to everybody. I know it's just absolutely devastating. And hopefully we can give you or help give you some answers. There's a million questions out there that I know people are having a hard time finding answers to.
Thank you both so much. I was originally connected to Joe and launched right into a conversation where I'm sure my anxiety as a parent and just as a human being was very apparent. But I know both of you come to this conversation with lots of knowledge and experience in the subject of wildfire smoke and air quality. I think so many of us in Los Angeles just want answers to simple questions like, is the air safe for us to go outside? Is it safe for our children? Is it safe for newborns? What does that mean for pregnant people, people with asthma, et cetera? So let's just start by talking about the air, because it seems we can't get any straight answers. The air in Los Angeles, it's now the first week of February. It's been about a month since the fires started in the Pacific Palisades and surrounding areas. And let's just get a little bit of an overview. Maybe, Joe, you can start by just talking about the air and what that covers when we're talking about air in the surrounding areas.
Yeah, sure. So, obviously during the active fire, you have smoke plumes, and we know the wildfire smoke, and in this case, an urban wildfire, the smoke will travel many hundreds of miles. And this isn't surprising to people. People probably track things like the AQI to look at outdoor air pollution levels, and you can see the levels of these particles or PM 2.5 elevated over wide regions. Sometimes we see fires on the West Coast and we see the smoke hitting the East Coast of the United States. So the levels were intense. I think the bigger question then is, well, what's happening on a local level? And we could talk about that, meaning what's happening around your house that's not captured by these regional monitors, and also what's in the smoke. So we know that urban wildfires are really quite different. You have metals from cars and building materials. You have a lot of organic chemicals from the furniture that are in homes. And so we know that the toxicity of urban wildfire smoke, it can be quite different. And I'll give you one piece of data that is public and is available through some monitoring networks. There's one air quality monitoring station in LA, Southeast LA, that actually doesn't just measure particles and things like that. It actually measures the types of metals that are in the air. And sure enough, during the active wildfire and smoke, we saw elevated levels of metals, in particular metals like lead and arsenic that were emitted during the wildfire, which confirms what we suspected about the types of things that are burning during this urban wildfire. Those levels returned back to normal quickly after the active fires were put out. But we know that tells us, right? We have a release and we have this kind of acute exposure that's happening with the smoke. And you have that smoke that's traveled that distance. We know it's enriched, at least in metals, and people are sampling for a whole bunch of other things out there we can talk about. Those particles eventually settle out onto land. And then now that the fires are out, the concern is, well, what happens with resuspension? So certainly on the burn site, you can resuspend some of that soot and ash, but also outside of the burn site where those particles had settled on roadways and on homes and roofs of buildings, you can get a resuspension of those settled particles. So that's pretty much the picture we had at the time of the fires based on our regional air quality monitoring networks and the types of things we're concerned about.
And you touched on this briefly, but when people think of wildfire smoke, people can think of a variety of different ideas when it comes to what's in that smoke. What is, and correct me if I'm wrong, what's so concerning about this fire in particular in the Pacific Palisades and the one that was in Altadena is what was burned in that wildfire, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We have a lot of data on wildfire smoke, and Lindsey can talk about the health effects, what we know about wildfire smoke, even from wildland fires, right? And so we know they're more toxic, but also these type of fires are really quite different for the reasons we talked about, and I think are obvious. And to your point, right, the release of metals, of fuels burning from our homes and in our cars, or batteries in electric vehicles, all the myriad chemicals we have in our homes from our furnishings and the way we construct buildings. And also we have old buildings that may have had lead or even things like asbestos. And then when you're combusting these materials, you create these combustion byproducts, and I can name some of these that can also be toxic. So the chemicals, the original chemicals that might have been in your furniture, or whatever, can change into different formats. So we're actually, a lot of the scientific community is mobilizing to try to understand specifically what was released beyond the things we normally and typically measure. But I think the metal signal is an interesting signal that shows you that monitoring site's about 20 miles from the Palisades fire. And we saw the mobilization of higher levels of some of these metals off-site. Yep.
So, Lindsey, can you talk about the health part of life after a wildfire like this? I think this is something that so many of us are curious about, and also feel like there has never been a natural disaster of this size. So we can only imagine what this means for our health and for those who are breathing the air. But can you kind of give us a little bit of an overview about the health side of wildfire smoke?
Sure, and thanks for the question. And Joe, every time I hear you talk about wildfires, I learn something else. It's just, you're an incredible source of knowledge on this. So it's really nice to be here with both of you. When it comes to kids and the effect of wildfire smoke, we can think of it in a couple of different ways. There are these immediate direct effects on kids' biology. You can think of this as the effects of inhaling wildfire smoke, or of, if you're pregnant, potentially that fetus being exposed through a mother breathing in smoke. And so those are effects that happen in the moment. And scientists in a variety of different settings are still working to really understand these effects on different levels. And it's important when we think about kids to understand that these effects can really be different than in adults, because kids' biological systems are developing quite rapidly, and they're really sensitive to all these exposures that they have in their environment. And that includes the effects of wildfire smoke. So when you're developing, and every minute by minute, your brain, but not only your brain, your immune system, your metabolic system, your immune system, they're all changing. They're actually reading what's happening in the environment, and they develop in response to what they read. And so you may hear some of the effects, like children who are exposed to wildfire smoke having higher rates of respiratory illnesses in the moment, and then subsequently, and that's because of how their respiratory and immune systems read and respond to these effects. So the second kind of category of effects are indirect, and that's sort of the experiences that children have and that their caregivers have as a result of being displaced or experiencing these fires. And when it comes to the direct effects, it begins actually well before birth. There's, clear and ever emerging scientific knowledge that shows that during periods of wildfire exposure, we see soon after higher rates of preterm births, which we think of as births born before 37 weeks. And we don't think of that necessarily always in our public discussions or in our policy discussions as a health effect on children. But, there's many preterm babies who go on to live full, healthy, happy lives without sequelae. But when you're born preterm, you have a heightened risk for becoming very ill or dying in the newborn period, of developing a range of health disorders throughout your lifetime. So the smoke exposure before you're born actually very much matters. And then in young children, the effects really depend on the stage of development that they're exposed. And development is so dynamic. So the effects on young children can be different than on adolescents, because the timing actually of the exposure really matters when it comes to kids. So we see, effects on their respiratory system, effects on their learning and on their mental health. And then the effects of displacement are really important and can kind of cascade throughout the life course. So the effects of, having to leave your home, or experiencing evacuation, or not being able to go to school, those things all really matter when it comes to kids' development.
So I like that you're talking about kind of a overarching theme of development, because a lot of, what's at play here is just people's mental health. And, do you send your kid back to school? Do you keep them out of school? Obviously, when the fires were going on, people were evacuating in a very large area surrounding the Pacific Palisades and surrounding Altadena, it seemed like pretty much everywhere in Los Angeles was under some level of evacuation order. And people were just living life minute by minute, hour by hour on decisions for them and their families. Now that the fires are 100% contained, can you walk us through what it means when you say exposure to wildfire smoke? Because it's one thing to be aware of a fire going on and smelling the smoke, but I think what's most confusing and concerning to people now is there's still exposure because of how much was burned and how much will be, reintroduced to the air and re-brought up in the cleanup process. So can you talk a little bit about what it actually means to have exposure to wildfire smoke?
We both probably have different perspectives on this. I think the first part is understanding that it's not a single exposure to wildfire smoke that one child has that's the same as any other child. When we think about development and exposure, we think about it in the context of something that we call the developmental environment. And that's really, you have to look at actually the sum of all the exposures and the experiences that kids are having, where they're living, where they're learning, where they're playing. So part of it, I think, is understanding where the exposures are. And that's going to be different for different kids. So a big part of wildfire smoke exposure, and something that I learned from Joe early on, is a lot of the smoke that's outdoors actually comes in. And so up to half of what we breathe in the indoor air environment comes from outdoors. So monitoring the air and understanding what the air quality exposure is in children's environments outdoors is really important. But I think there's precedent by really great places like Denver and Boston that are monitoring indoor air quality in schools. And we're understanding what the quality of children's indoor environment is. Because we say, don't go outside when there's wildfires, keep the kids inside. We don't actually know what their exposures are inside. And we have reason to believe and understand that the air quality might be altered for weeks after fires occur. And if that's true outside, it's going to be true inside too. And we do have really good information from that, from the air quality index and ideas about what air quality might be like. But it's not a perfect assessment. And I think we don't necessarily monitor as much in many of our settings indoors. So I think understanding what those exposures are matter. And then thinking about when you're coming back into spaces, what's the kind of balance of pros and cons? Like you said, it's really important if kids can't play outdoors or if they can't get their energy out and we keep them indoors, that has a negative effect on development too. So I think understanding the context of where you are and what those balance of exposures are is really important when you're determining risk for a particular kid in a setting. So though it's sort of frustrating in the sense that there's not a one-size-fits-all recommendation for, when you can go to a playground or when you can keep your kid, in their daycare setting. But I think it's understanding how to both monitor and then manage the exposure in these particular settings, then it can help us make decisions that sort of balance risk and benefit.
Yeah, so I really like Lindsey's perspective, and I agree. And I think out of the context of, let's say, a home that's survived in the burn area or the home directly adjacent, but I think for the vast majority of people, I agree. The larger context of exposure and what that means and is really important. And also, despite the uncertainties right now around what's in the air and water, there are actually some pretty basic tips you can take to reduce risk and actually keep your home safe and keep schools safe. And Lindsey's exactly right. Most of the outdoor air pollution you breathe happens inside. I don't think people realize that. So what that means is then your home or school can actually become a great tool for protecting your kids and your family and yourself. And we put out some guidance already on this. I think there's three main areas or three things I would recommend or I would do if it was my house. The first is you really want to filter the air. I can talk about the types of filters. You upgrade the level of filtration in your central HVAC system if you have it to a MERV 13 filter. You can use these portable air cleaners with a HEPA filter that people are probably very familiar with. Those are excellent if they're sized right for the room. So filter the air is number one. Two, you want to control the dust. Basic things and making sure you're not bringing in dust off the street like many people do anyway, kicking off your shoes at the door, wiping pets' feet. You want to damp wipe surfaces. And you want to get a vacuum that has a HEPA filter. So just like the filter for the air, you get a filter for the dust. The third thing is what Lindsey mentioned is this monitoring piece. You really want to measure what's happening in your home. A lot of people just relying on these EPA monitors, the AQI, these big regional monitors. Those are great, They're not quite telling you what's happening in your home, on your street, on your block. And so these devices are, they cost a couple $100, but they'll measure airborne particles and airborne gases. I think if you do all of that, filter the air, control the dust, and measure, it would go a long way to reassuring people, not falsely, but giving them the confidence to say, hey, I'm taking steps and exposures look okay, or nothing seems that off in my house. I'm feeling good about being there. A lot of people have no choice but to be there. So it's incumbent on us to give guidance to say, hey, if you have to be there, there are things you can do to feel comfortable and safe, and you can actually manage this at school, home, offices, or wherever. Just a handful of steps that are really proven to be effective.
I got excited about what you said about schools and other places that we can do this because, I think during COVID, a lot of places, early care and education centers, schools, under the guidance of Joe and other experts at his Healthy Building Center, really upgraded the filtration systems to a lot of the levels that are really helpful, and making sure that they're up and running to those to their full capacity and function, and making sure actually that as parents were advocating for them being in place in the spaces where really young kids spend time is really important, because I think schools in particular got a lot of really great attention and upgraded filtration during COVID. If you think about where kids spend their time and where their exposures are actually happening, a lot of it is at home and in their bedrooms, and that we can adapt and make clean, the air in the ways that Joe talked about. And I think actually really making sure that the other places that kids spend a lot of time, namely where young children who are in daycare settings or informal care settings or early care and education centers, I think bringing them into the conversation and saying, hey, this is really important. There's a very young child here. And so the quantity of exposure that happens in this space because of the length of time that a child spends there, it's actually really important to pay attention to these spaces, the indoor spaces, not just, the playgrounds where kids are spending their time.
That's all amazing information and tips on how to protect yourself, your loved ones, your family in this time. I'm going to ask a question. How long do we need to do that for?
All right. So I think we have some, here's how I would approach it, right? I think we have limited data right now, but I know a lot more is coming very soon. So that's not satisfying for today, but I do know people hopefully feel good that the scientific community is fully ramped up and testing is happening, air, water, dust, soil at scale. And I think we'll have a lot more information soon. I think the reality is you're going to have emissions from the site in the coming weeks and months. Anytime there's wind, heavy machinery, all of that settled soot and ash can get resuspended. So what that means for you is going to depend on how close you are, what the wind conditions are if you're downwind. But that'll go on for a while until phase 2 is over. Phase 1 is removal of hazardous materials. Phase 2, same thing happened in Maui after the wildfires there. Phase 2, you start to really clear out debris and even some of that contaminated soil. So you're going to see this sporadically. I think it remains to be known at what distance and how important this is, depending on where you live. So that's totally unsatisfying right now, but clearly I still think we're in the response emergency crisis phase of this. We'll have a lot more data soon that will help us answer these kind of questions. Like, for example, the consortium I'm part of is multi-university consortium. Right now is doing air quality monitoring with vans equipped with high-end scientific instrumentation, running loop after loop after loop all around neighborhoods, around Altadena, Palisades, around LA, collecting detailed measurements and really mapping the extent and scale. One, what are we seeing? At what levels? Is it important for health? Where are we seeing it? Are we seeing little hot spots or not? So that's the type of information that will start to come out very soon and aid decision-making. And so, it's unsatisfying, but I think it's weeks to months, but I think we will have a lot more information in the coming week or 2 or even 3 around, is everybody impacted at what distance or what level?
So when you say surrounding area LA, this is something that's also very confusing for people that are in these areas, because LA is pretty widespread.
Yeah.
And when somebody says, monitor the air or be mindful of your outdoor exposure or even indoor exposure, if you are in close proximity to a burn site, what does that mean? close proximity to a burn site?
Yeah, this is one of the hardest questions I've heard, and I haven't heard great answers. And we posted some of this on my Harvard Healthy Buildings website because I think people deserve some kind of answers. And I kind of said, here's how I would approach it. First, I should caveat, if you're right next to it, if your house was heavily impacted, I think that's a different level of response and controls. I think you have to be really careful. But here's how I would judge when you need extra precautions. First, I think the recommendations I gave already are good for everybody to do. Filter air, better vacuum, control the dust. But I was thinking about it this way. First, I would evaluate it based on 3 factors. Did you see it? Did you see soot and ash? Do you see a layer outdoors? Do you see a layer on your property? Do you see it in your home? If that happened, you're in an area that was highly impacted, and you should take extra precautions. It's imperfect, but I think it's a good measure. The second one is, do you smell it? So we don't want to rely on people's senses to have to make a judgment, but it actually is valuable in the sense that you can smell it being the aftermath of smoke. And because if you're smelling something, what you're actually smelling is the off-gassing of VOCs, or volatile chemicals. So during the smoke event, materials that are porous will absorb a lot of these chemicals and then slowly off-gas them over time. So if you can smell it, what you're actually smelling is the off-gassing of the VOCs. So if you have seen it, or you had seen it in an area you know is highly impacted, if you can smell it or still smell it, you know you're getting the off-gassing of VOCs. That could be outdoors or indoors. The third thing is, do you sense it? So I would measure. These are these lower cost monitors. You can measure what PM 2.5 is, airborne particles. And you can look for TVOCs, total volatile organic compounds, which is airborne gases. Again, these are not scientific instruments, but they're good consumer grade, and at least gives you a sense of what's happening in your space. That's how I would judge it right now without access to any of these detailed scientific maps, who's impacted where. As a person, I'm a dad, I have 3 kids. I have family and friends out there. This is the guidance I would give. That's how I would judge whether or not I need these extra precautions and I should be extra careful, or just take the general good precautions around good filtration in the home, air purifiers, and the like. And I can talk about what the extreme precautions would look like, but I think that's good general advice. And this is how I would approach it. This is how I'd think about it in the absence of really crystal clear data that may or may not come, but hopefully we'll get some of those gaps filled in the coming weeks.
So close proximity, meaning if you're in an area that you saw smoke, ash, or soot on your home or your property, is considered in close proximity to a burn site. Obviously, if you have your home that was in the burn site, for example, our home is in a burn site, it is not advised that you live there or go there without the proper PPE to navigate your way in your setting. So that's helpful, I think, for people to understand what it means to be in close proximity to a burn site. Lindsey, you're a practicing pediatrician, and we all know that when raising children, also even for us as adults, being outdoors is good for our mind, body, and soul, and especially for the development of young children. I'm born and raised in Los Angeles in Southern California, so I spend a huge amount of time outdoors, as does everyone who was living in these areas that these fires have occurred. And so being outside is part of preschool environments. It's part of everyday life. It's part of just the entire nature of where these fires occurred. So telling us all to stay inside is, as you guys are familiar with having snow days where you're inside, we have a couple rain days, but having us all be inside, to me, is such a foreign concept. Can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, the importance of trying to find a balance, and is a balance even safe for adults and for children who, as you said, are developing rapidly? We're nervous about their lungs, their whole physical well-being, their development overall. If you're pregnant, the development of your child. So these things run through my mind as a parent. And how do you find a balance to just not send your kid outside at all?
Yeah, definitely not that, I think, because I don't think any parent out there would survive. I totally agree with you on all accounts. And there's sort of this intangible when it comes to play, right? And having your kids be able to be outside. And kids just have a different ability to access that already based on, where you live and what resources you have and how close safe green spaces to your house to begin with, even before a fire. And so these sort of challenges are really amplified afterwards with certain people being able to, get out and access green space that's farther away. So I think for me, it's really, really important to think about how we can preserve not only play, but all these other like really important routines that you named. Like, when do you go back to school? When do you go to the playground? Like, these things are all really important, and they're not measured, and they're not, talked about as like really tangible things like how much asthma you get, but they're so important, I think, to preserve. And it comes back to, I think, understanding your exposure too, because as Joe said, if you think about it, if you're very close to or proximal to a burn site and your level of exposure is higher, you might make a different decision than if you're farther away and your air quality is different, as well as the time that's elapsed during the fire. So now, with control of the fires and the air quality, still being effective, but not being what it was at the time where the fires were burning, I think it starts with understanding what the outdoor air quality is like in the spaces where you want to go and spend time, and then measuring and making a risk assessment about how long you're going to stay there accordingly. I think we're still a long way from understanding doses, like how much smoke exposure is bad and at what time in development and what are the exact effects of those things. So, it's frustrating in a way to, that I can't say 15 minutes at this air quality will, cause this outcome and this amount of exposure is safe. So there's no, I think, prescription like that, which can feel frustrating. And I think the other thing that's hard for parents, that's always a balance in these situations, is that different kids, even at the same age, have different abilities to wear masks and tolerate masks outside. And so for very young children, I think if the air quality was, above 50, above 100, I would be more wary about spending time outside if they were unable to wear a mask. And then in older children, like, I have one of my three who's much more likely to leave a KN95 on and run around outside at that level of air quality than the others. And so I think if you're able to make a reasonable assessment that the air quality is in a reasonably safe range, for me, Joe, tell me if you think that there's more precise estimates than this, but I would say, if it's 50 or below, you should feel really comfortable probably going outside with children and at least letting them play for a period of time, because the benefits of that, again, are like going to outweigh, I think, probably at this time, a short dose of lower exposure. So I'm sorry, I feel like I wish I could be more precise than that, but that's sort of how I think through it and how I try to make like an educated kind of balance between the negative effects on development that are going to happen if those kids don't go outside at all, and then making a reasonable assessment about when the levels are so unsafe that probably it's, not going to be in their best interest to go outdoors.
So are you saying that for people who are in areas that are considered close proximity to a burn site, that we need to be monitoring the air when we make decisions every day about whether or not to go outside ourselves and take our children outside, that we need to be measuring the air quality before choosing to go outside?
I think you can think about it on different levels. You could think about it like Joe said, if you can smell it or see it, you probably don't even need to check that that's probably unsafe. But actually, those of us, I think, who think about this a lot, it's in the morning. It's one of the things that I look at. I understand I have a child with asthma, and I understand what the air quality is in my area, and I do make assessments accordingly. We had a wildfire near us in the Northeast recently, a few miles from my kids' school. And so I did sort of every morning check on what those levels were. And I don't think that we need to hour by hour be looking and assessing our exact air quality, but it can give you a general idea for what the air quality is like in your area. And I think it's just information that we don't have to hyper focus on, but I think it can weigh into the decision making actually in a really helpful way. And as I've gotten to know Joe and his work more and more, I think it's just part of being an informed parent, the way we inform our decision making about a lot of other things, what we feed our kids, what we, do at the doctor's office, all these things, it's just part of our health and well-being. And I think it's not talked about as often, but I do think that the quality of the air and the places our kids spend time is a really helpful piece of information that influences their health. And I never really think of information as a bad thing. So I guess my short answer to your question would be yes.
Okay. So I mean, for myself personally, I'm somebody that looks at what what my kids are doing or what they're consuming and, being mindful of that. But adding to my routine now that I'm in an area that is in close proximity to a burn site, the air quality is a new part of a routine and one that I think will become part of a lot of people's routines who are concerned about air quality, because of course, for so many of us, when we think about the air quality or wildfire, when we go outside and we smell smoke, of course, we think, okay, this is not a good time to be outside. But I think what's so confusing and scary to so many of us is that even if it's not something that we're smelling, that you're saying it can still be dangerous to be outside.
This is how I would think about it. And I agree with Lindsey. I think I try to approach this as, what can you do to reduce risk in the house? Knowing kids are going to be outside, they need to be outside. And I think special consideration if you're really in the burn area or directly adjacent. But I think the monitoring piece is particularly useful. I don't think it's something you have to be doing every hour of the day. I don't think you'd be doing it for weeks and weeks. But I think in the early days, to have your hand on one of these things, to just get a sense of it. So certainly you can check the AQI. But I think we're going to start to see patterns pretty quickly, is how I would think about it. And even patterns in your own life, right? So, hey, the AQI actually looks okay. It's becoming a little less reliable. It's telling you regionally, okay, things are okay. But you start measuring every day and you get a sense, hey, the particle levels are down low. I go outside, not too windy, the particle levels low. Pretty soon you stop paying attention to it in a good way. Say, okay, I feel reassured. I'm not seeing anything unusual. Maybe there's some activity on the site. You have a little monitor there. Okay, it's actually doing okay. Not that you have to be paranoid and checking every minute, but I think you'd slowly get a handle. It's good. I do this with my class here at Harvard. We give all the students one of these sensors. The first couple of days, everyone's intensely looking at it. And then you start to get a handle on how your house is performing, what's happening outside, what's typical levels. So I think that can be really, really reassuring in the interim when you're waiting for this guidance. Because I think if there are areas that are of special concern, let's say there's a certain wind pattern that's blowing certain materials off to a certain community, I think the scientific community will get a handle on that kind of information relatively quickly. I think we'll know this in the next week or two if there's areas of special concern. In the interim, that's how I would judge it. Otherwise we have no real way to assess it. You can smell it if you saw it, but also the sensing part is really key. Did you see it? Can you sense it? But also, can you actually measure it? And I agree with Lindsey. It's a good thing to have. It doesn't have to be a check every second and make split-second decisions. And you control the exposures you can. So you control what's happening inside the school when they're indoors. You control what's happening at the home. So at least they're spending a third of their life sleeping. And you're controlling those, and you're letting them also be active with their friends, kind of renormalizing some of the community stuff that we know is critical also.
There's been a lot of confusion about AQI index and monitoring that. So many of us have relied on AQI as being the telltale sign of, is it safe to go outside? Is it not safe to go outside? There's a lot of feedback saying AQI for a wildfire of this magnitude is actually not accurate when it comes to if it's safe or not safe to go outside. What's the best way for people to be monitoring air in their specific area?
Yeah, AQI is great for big regional events, wildfire smoke. You can track this. People have gotten used to this. Regional events. It's not going to tell you what's happening locally as these kind of resuspension activities may or may not happen. I'll give you two other resources. One is, so you have this AQI, which is a government network, but there's also kind of a citizen science monitoring network out there called Purple Air. Purple Air are air quality sensors looking for some of the same things we get from AQI, but it's people who just kind of have these at their house. And you see the network. If you go on Purple Air, look up Purple Air right now, you will see air quality measurements all over LA and all over the country. In fact, all over the world. So it's a kind of like a social sharing of outdoor air quality, but you kind of get some granularity. EPA has these big, sophisticated scientific monitoring stations in select locations. This kind of starts to fill the gap. If you pair that with your handheld monitor, then you can start to see, hey, certain areas are tracks. I should also say, when you look at Purple Air data, or even your handheld data, it's very common to have short-term spikes unrelated to anything, not related to this fire. For example, if you're cooking and doing a stir fry in the kitchen, I'll put some numbers on this, maybe the particle levels for PM 2.5 are typically less than 5 in your home. I'd like to see them under 10 for sure. But while you're cooking, it could be 100 or 200, which is similar to what happens on a wildfire day. When you sit on your couch, little plumes pop up. So I wouldn't be too concerned with a split-second blip, a 5-minute blip. It goes when I'm cooking. The VOC levels go up when I put on, I don't know, I don't use shampoo or anything, but or I don't even know, perfume or something. I'm saying things I don't know anything about. Anyway, when you use hand sanitizer, a surface cleaner, you'll get these spikes. I wouldn't worry too much about that kind of stuff. I'd pay attention. You get used to the signal if you have these monitors. So the purple layers have that too. All of a sudden, you'll see a place that has a giant spike. Well, you don't know if the person's using a leaf blower in their yard, or hopefully not at this moment, or doing something else that's just spiking the sensor. So it's very much about trends over time.
Got it. And so purple air, and also a handheld monitor that you're saying people can buy, which I will link out to. And is there another way people can monitor, make it part of their daily routine to check whether or not it's safe to go outside?
There are going to be other data sources available. I hope it starts to get consolidated, because I know, for example, like Caltech has a monitoring station. They're publishing some of their data. There's another group at the South Coast Air Monitoring District that just published some data from their mobile monitoring today. So to be honest, right now, I think it's confusing for the general public, because you kind of need to know which node to find. Everyone knows AQI. Purple air is really well known. But some of these other monitoring networks, I think there's going to be a bigger effort to consolidate these, at least my understanding, maybe through the Department of Public Health, so that people can find this data a little more quickly, a little more easily. But I'd say for right now, I would use AQI. I'd take a peek at purple air. I like those a lot. And I'd have my little handheld sensor to give a sense of what's happening in my home.
Kids have soccer games. Kids have basketball games. You want to take your baby to the park. You want to take your newborn on a walk. Is it safe?
Yeah, I think at this point, with the fires under control and no active smoke visible in the area, people can take reasonable precautions like going to the playground and going for walks and having time with their children outdoors. I do this brief AQI check when I go out. It comes up on my weather app. And if it's reasonable, I carry about my activities. In those younger kids, I think there's some really specific things that you can do that mitigate the risks that the kids have now, which is a lot of the stuff that Joe talked about in the beginning in terms of potential ingestion. If you look at the ash reports from Maui, and after the fires settled, a lot of the metals and other things that can be harmful to young children's development can actually be ingested. And so kids have what we call this hand-to-mouth behavior that's really important. So if you go to the playground and you climb up the monkey bars, and there's some residual dust that's, you're not seeing plumes of dust coming up. In that case, I would probably not go to that playground. But, that you assume there's some microscopic amount of dust. When you come home before a snack, you maybe don't have a snack at the playground, wash or wipe your kids' hands off, because when that dust is on their hands and then they eat with their hands, it gets into their mouth. And this is ingestion patterns that we've known for decades because of how lead exposure happens in young children. So lead, especially in places like Massachusetts, where there's a lot of old paint, gets into the dust and into the dirt and tracked in through the home. And so when you take your kids outside to the playground, or they're playing in the dirt, and then they come inside and feed themselves, that dust from outside gets inside in that way. And so this is a really easy thing that you can do that maintains your ability to play outside and lowers your exposure. For a newborn who's in a carriage on a walk, I think at this point, with a reasonable air quality index, it's quite safe to go outside and take a walk. And the benefits of, not only exercise, but community, being around your friends again, walking with another mother, like those benefits to me are going to outweigh the exposure that child would have during the time that they were outside on that walk.
This fire and the aftermath, in a lot of Zoom sessions and also a lot of articles have been written, were compared to the Maui fires of reintegration, and also to the 9/11 reintegration back into Manhattan. That obviously alarms people, because a lot of the conversation around that was, now a lot of those people have breathing issues, have lung cancer, have COPD. Can you speak a little bit? Obviously, we're so early in the life after these recent fires in Los Angeles, but there's a huge amount of stress of, if I go outside, am I going to pay for that in 10 years from now? If I send my kids outside and they're breathing at a more rapid rate than I am, are they going to be paying for that in 10 years from now by having severe asthma? The guilt factor, the concern, the anxiety around all of those decisions. Can you guys both you come from different experiences, having a lot of knowledge in both of these areas, but just talk a little bit about that kind of constant level of anxiety so many people are experiencing when trying to navigate life after these fires.
So I can start. I mean, I've heard the comparison to 9/11 a couple of times, quite different for obvious reasons, but also, I get it. You have buildings and different types of materials that are in dust and soot, and clearly there were health concerns. But most of the health impacts and concerns were for the responders and the cleanup crews in Lower Manhattan that really weren't really wearing protection at all, or didn't have time to put protection on, even in the coming weeks and months. So that's really the focus. The health concerns there. For the people living there is much lower health concern because there was cleanup being done, right? People, before they went to apartments, people should do this too. If you saw soot or ash in LA, right, you clean up and make sure you're controlling some of any of that residual. So it's quite different in that regard. And where I think it's similar is that I am quite worried about the workers going back onto this site. And at least I've seen pictures of and heard reports of not great PPE, meaning they're not wearing great respiratory protection. So in terms of the group I'm most worried about is the group that's going back on the site, and even some people going back maybe to their homes to check it out. I get the desire to, who don't have and I can talk about what the appropriate protection would be. That concerns me the most. That is the similarity I could see going into a site that's still quite active with dust, soot and ash, and is quite dangerous still. That concerns me the most. In terms of Maui, I want to share, we released some of this data from our Maui work. We sampled air in homes, and it was similarly devastating. I've never seen such devastation until in LA, and loss of life, loss of homes, loss of community. It stays with you. And even homes that were directly adjacent, I mean, on the fire line, on the burn line, I was expecting to see a lot worse, to be totally honest. And I think the sampling that we did probably reassured a lot of people. It certainly reassured me that with these controls in place and with the concern about lingering and constant resuspension during the phase 1 and phase 2, things were actually okay for most people, right? Like I was expecting to see a lot worse, if I'm totally honest, in the homes that were right near it. So it gives me some hope that with some of these controls we talked about, air, dust, not limiting kids entirely, right? So we can still live, but try to control what we can control to the best extent, and making sure they're doing what they need to do on the site. That gives me, we're doing the testing to confirm it, but at least tells me that in a similar scenario, urban wildfire, that it's not always the case that you have this resuspension carrying, toxicity all the time, 24/7. We just didn't see it in nearly all of the homes that we tested.
If you are in a surrounding area to Los Angeles, do you need to, or even in Northern California, do you need to be worried about air quality?
Well, my answer is always going to be that, yeah, you should. I mean, the air quality is not great. And a lot of places, the country and the world, and some of these steps we're talking about, and Lindsey has been talking about, like improving filtration doesn't cost much. Having some of these air purifiers doesn't cost much. That's good practice for everybody everywhere. And we know there are many benefits when you do that, for kids with asthma, or just all of us, for adults too. It's just good. And these are just generally good practices. So to the point I think you're asking is, do you worry about the smoke or resuspension from this site? I think the answer is no. But if you're talking about generally, do you want to have good indoor air quality? I think these tips are tips I've made. They're good against COVID, influenza, RSV, wildfire smoke, general outdoor air pollution, exhaust from automobiles, you name it. These are just generally good tips to have a healthier home.
You mentioned earlier the different phases of cleanup. And since you have experience with this with the Maui fires, can you just briefly talk about the phases of cleanup? And then maybe, Lindsey, you can talk about what is of concern in those phases if you are in close proximity to a burn site.
This is really the removal of the extremely hazardous, looking for propane tanks, batteries, things that are really quite dangerous, basements that may be covered by debris that represent fall and hazards, like really dangerous conditions. So this is where you're getting trained people on site to remove the big, bad, really dangerous things. You do not want to be on these sites if you're not trained. The second phase is kind of a little bit more of the, how are we going to take down the remaining structures that exist, the chimneys, the burnt metal. And I don't know the specifics here, but I do know, for example, in Maui, they also clear a certain depth of soil, which represents a lot of the settled soot and ash. I don't know the exact depth they're going to take in LA. Usually it's a couple inches of soil. So the idea is that you're starting with a clean slate, taking down all the rest of the toxic materials, maybe taking down some structures that are not structurally safe anymore. That then preps you for phase 3, which is the rebuilding.
Okay. And Lindsey, in those phases, obviously we're in phase 1, as Joe mentioned right now, and how long that will last until phase 2, I don't know. But when we're in phase 2, which is going to be the removal, and, it will bring all of that up back again into the air, are there increased levels of concern that we should have when going outside as individuals and as parents with children that we want to send outside? Is that something that we need to be extra cautious or mindful of in that phase?
Yeah, I think that phase is another one where you might add into your routine, like get a general idea of the pattern of the air quality in the area where you are. And that's going to change according to where is the dust being kicked up? Where are things being cleared? Where are the areas that are being actively worked on? And so again, it's part of that pattern recognition that I think Joe mentioned. And I think people will have a general idea based on what's going on in their area over a period of days about what's going on in the air and the reasonable steps that they might take to keep kids either indoors in a safe, clean room, or that they can feel more comfortable going outside. And I think that's one of those times where if the air quality is in that more unhealthy range, that you might choose to say, I'm going to use this period of time to optimize how clean the air is in my home and keep my kids inside. And then as it moves on and the particular area of exposure changes, you might be more likely to go outside. So it might be a time where we're more in tune with some of this information and monitoring and sensing that Joe's described than in other times. In the third phase, when things sort of settle out a little bit more, I think people can feel more comfortable. But I think it's a time that, just like during heat waves, right? When there's heat waves happening, we look at the temperature, we get an idea of what the outdoor conditions are, and we decide on our behaviors as a result. Like you wouldn't take your kids out at noon in the middle of a heat wave because you'd say this is the time of day that it's probably not as healthy for their development. And the younger they are, maybe the more likely they are to be sensitive to those exposures. And I think it's probably the same type of informed decision-making in that kind of middle zone.
People say that LA has always had bad air quality, which it has. This, to my understanding, is a different level of bad air quality. Is that correct?
Yeah, for sure. LA has some of the highest levels in the country. But to put some numbers on this, right? So now I'm not talking about AQI, which people may be familiar with. I'm talking about the particle concentrations. So I'll give you EPA says the limit now, they just lowered it, should be 9 micrograms per cubic meter on an annual basis. And so it's common we see 15, 20 in LA. We see this in Boston sometimes. It's just LA can have sustained levels. But the levels during wildfires can hit 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 micrograms per cubic meter. And so that's extraordinary and quite different. And the mix of pollutants different. It matters. The source matters. So, outdoor air pollution is bad enough, but when you have the urban wildfire, you get a completely different mix of hazards that are from the materials from our homes and offices and schools and everything else than automobiles.
Based off of both of you knowing so much in the science space and research space, and also having experience in studying fire like the one in Maui, when will the air in LA be back to what it was before this fire?
That's a really hard question. I think we should caveat this, and I'll answer your question because I think I'll give you my opinion and for wherever it's worth. But I think people should recognize too that there was a major spike during the smoke. People could see the smoke, and that's when we saw most of it. When I talked about the lead levels, right, during the smoke event, that monitor is now, right after the smoke cleared, the major smoke, it's back to normal. So already the major emissions have stopped. The concern is these ongoing emissions from resuspension, which will be sporadic and which will be concentrated in different areas at different times based really on wind direction and what activity is happening, and also what they're cleaning up and what was burned in that space, which is unknowable, but I think some of the monitoring will help us out. I think the answer to when it's like, okay, like there's no more residual coming off is going to be when phase 2 is done. That's when they cleaned and removed all of the remaining building material, cars, and taken away all of that ash and soot from the site. That's when it's, I don't say all clear, but that's when then there's not going to be any more to be emitted. But that does not mean that interim period means it's like wildly unsafe during the active smoke event until the all clear when phase 2 is over. It's still going to be a gradual decrease and improvement continually. And I think if you're doing these steps we're talking about, I think you can make that interim period during phase 2 be as safe as it possibly can and be a place that I would personally feel comfortable if I was taking those steps. People might have different levels of comfort and different means of what they can do. A lot of people cannot do anything about this, so we have to give them some of these lower cost strategies to stay safe. Mm-hmm. So that's how I would think about it. But it's going to take time. This phase 2 is many months, many months.
Lindsey, when it comes to the subject of masks with children, this is something that, I mean, for us parents who parented during COVID, how important is mask wearing for children that are age appropriate with wearing masks and going outdoors?
Yeah, again, I think it's context specific and dependent on the age of the child too. I see this a lot in my pediatric practice where, you say, oh, kids 2 and above can reasonably wear a well-fitting mask. And then I don't know anybody who's ever tried to put a mask on a 3-year-old knows that that's actually operationally really hard to do. So I think it's a time where we need to give ourselves a little bit of grace as parents in terms of, the likelihood of if children are outside for a reasonable amount of time and they're playing and there's not visible smoke and there's not visible dust plumes, and you have a young child, it's probably going to be okay for that period of time for that child to run and play and be themselves and be able to just like have joy in their environment. And the benefits of that are going to outweigh the benefits, most likely, I think, in my opinion, with imperfect information here, of that 3-year-old wearing a mask for the, 30 to 45 minutes that they're at a playground. I think if, young children, they, like you said, they breathe more quickly. They're very active. They're closer to the ground. There's a lot of things that just make mask wearing really, really difficult. And I think that it's, again, finding that balance. So if you're in an area like Joe talked about, where you're right up against the burn zone, there's active dust, there's, you're worried that you're very close, then maybe that higher dose exposure is more important to make your mom point about and really insist on the mask. And then I think in other cases, we can make more reasonable judgments. And this gets to Joe's point about different, each of us has different levels of risk tolerance and risk assessment. But as somebody who, myself errs on the more kind of cautious side of parenting and tends to take some more precautions, I would feel comfortable in a lot of cases letting those young kids just have a moment to play and be and experience a playground without a mask. And I think that that's an okay step to take right now.
We got a lot of questions about people who are pregnant being in Los Angeles.
Yeah, my heart goes out to them because, pregnancy to me, it's like the ultimate stress test, right? It's like the physical stress, the psychological stress, and then you put the stress of like a life-changing wildfire on top of it. Like anytime I see the news, my heart goes out to like every single person who's experiencing a pregnancy at this time. And I think that it's really, really difficult to sort through all the information that comes through about hearing over and over and over again how at risk you are. I think that can really take a psychological toll. And I think for those people now who are living in areas that are, affected by cleanups, it's again like that balance of precautions of you probably don't go to the place where they're doing the active dust management. And, there's things that are aerosolized that you can see, that you can smell. But again, like so much of pregnancy is about connection and being able to get outside and, be around other people who are your support systems. And I think the balance of a lot of those positive exposures at this point is really going to outweigh for many people the negative exposures of some lower level smoke exposure on an air quality day where the air quality is, in that reasonably kind of safe zone.
Okay. Well, I feel like we have a lot of information. And I feel like for people who are from Southern California, it seems like we can round this up by saying for people who have submitted so many questions about is the air in LA safe, that the answer to that is monitor the air quality and incorporate that with best practices to keep you and your family safe. And if the air quality is appearing unhealthy or at dangerous levels, don't go outside. So kind of using logic there. And I think being mindful of the phases and the cleanup, that we're going to rely on people to communicate to us when those are happening. Great. We'll see about that. And just probably trying to find a balance between going about life as normal and also being mindful of what the air quality is on a day-by-day or pattern-by-pattern basis.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Katherine. And I think, Joe said something earlier in our conversation that sort of rings true. I think when there's times of uncertainty and when we're trying to make decisions with, less information than we think we had, we can sometimes take comfort in controlling the things that we can control. And I think thanks to people like Joe, we understand a lot more than we did even a few years ago about how we can keep indoor air quality safe for human health, right? Which is different than the way that it is sort of thought of in the past.
Joe, when you're saying about keeping the doors and windows and things closed in your house, are you suggesting not leaving windows and doors open at homes right now at all?
I think it's a good idea right now to have them closed. I think it's an extra layer. I don't think this is a forever solution, but I really also think these, making sure you have good filtration. So again, if you have, and I can give a couple more tips here. If you have a central system, look for those MERV 13 or higher rated filters. If you haven't changed your filter, do that immediately because the smoke can really impact and reduce the effectiveness of your filter. So if you haven't changed your filter, change it now. Look for these higher grade filters. Here's what you should look for in terms of these air purifiers or air cleaners. So I can give a couple tips on how to shop for these things. So you want to find an air cleaner, an air purifier that has a HEPA filter. HEPA filter is the best grade filter we have. And it can be hard to know which size to buy and all of this. So I'll give you a general rule of thumb. It's impossible, right? It's really hard. It's going to require you to look on the box or at least look it up in the manufacturer. But I'll give you something I think is relatively straightforward. The manufacturer should report something called the Clean Air Delivery Rate, or CADR. Some people just write CFM for cubic feet per minute. That sounds complicated, confusing. You're just looking for this number on the box, Clean Air Delivery Rate, or CADR. And my rule of thumb is look for a CADR of 300 for every 500 square feet of your house. So look for a device that has at least 300 for every 500 square feet. It's a rough rule of thumb. I think it at least gives you some guidance on how to size this right. A lot of the manufacturers will tell you what size room, but I think you can go a step further and make sure you oversize it. So one way is to oversize it. Second piece of advice related to air purifiers I want to give is about, if you want that extra precaution. So the air purifiers, most of the air purifiers you buy have a type of filter like a HEPA filter that captures particles. But those kind of filters do not capture gases. Gases go right through these filters. So what some air purifiers have is the particle filter, a HEPA filter, and then they add what's called activated carbon or activated charcoal that captures the gases. So you can look for a device that has both a HEPA filter plus activated charcoal. They market it differently, and that'll capture the gases. But here's a key hook. These carbon filters get filled up fast because there's not a lot of it in there most of the time. So there are some devices that have HEPA filters plus 15, 20, 30 pounds of the activated carbon. So if you want an air cleaner that's like top of the line, going to capture particles and gases, you look for one with a HEPA filter and a whole lot of that active carbon so it doesn't fill up too fast.
And how often should you be changing out those filters?
All right, so the particle filters, you can change every 3 months, 6 months, a year. The HEPA filters, they actually do better as they get dirtier, believe it or not. The carbon filters, it's nearly impossible to predict when they saturate. This is a real challenge. So I hope I'm making it not confusing, but kind of simple. But a lot of the devices out there just have a really thin layer of carbon, and it'll last, it's fine for a typical old house, wherever. But if you're using it, in an area and you really want a lot of control, you look for as much of that activated carbon, activated charcoal you can get. I think it'll last at least a month, depending on what it's exposed to. I'm hesitant to even say a number there, because they do fill up. Here's something interesting, though. The monitors I said, you can have this low-cost monitor, measures particles and VOCs, so particles and gases. You have your TVOC monitor, your volatile organic chemical monitor. You'll know how that filter's performing. If your VOCs are low, great, things are doing good. If your particles levels are low, great. So there's a good indicator. So you can kind of use the measurement, use these tips and tricks to keep your air clean in your house. And you can measure. You see the VOCs keep spiking all the time. Maybe swap out that filter and get the replacement filter.
Thank you both so much for this conversation. I mean, I'm filled with a lot of information right now that I'm going to consolidate, but I'm grateful that you guys both took time to talk through so much of this, because I know that it's on my mind as a LA native, and also on the minds of so many people who are in LA and affected by these fires, and trying to navigate what's best, and also not sit here thinking that if we go outside, or if our kids go outside, that we should, beat ourselves up about what's to come with that. I think there's a lot here, of course, in the mental health space that's at play as well. So I appreciate these answers.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. And I'll put a plug in too as a consumer. I go regularly to Joe's center website, and it's extremely digestible, and the information is really accessible. And he links to a lot of the products that we can pull into links for you as well. But for people who want to learn more about this, even after the wildfires are over, it's just a really incredible source of information. And it sort of sorts through the, noise because I think about air quality all the time for a living, and I had trouble knowing which one, to go and get. And so I have a lot of sympathy for people who are out there trying to make sense of this while they're already at a time that they're really stressed. So thank you, Joe, for everything that you and your team have done to teach all of us about all of this. You're just an incredible resource. And Katherine, thank you for making the space for this conversation, because you and I were talking before that kids are sometimes tagged onto the end of conversations about really big, important issues, and being able to highlight how this really uniquely affects them is just a really special opportunity. And I appreciate it.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Joe and Lindsey for coming on today and answering so many of our amazing questions that were submitted by you guys. These are unprecedented times. We all need to stick together and navigate these wild topics together. And I think just giving each other grace. I know there are a lot of anxious parents who wrote in wondering what to do about their situations and their children. I feel you. I'm right along there with you. And being able to talk to people like Joe and Lindsey is hopefully going to give us a little bit more clarity in our decision-making process, and some knowledge, because knowledge is power. And we just need to get through this one day at a time. So we're going to come back with some more topics we're going to discuss when it comes to these wildfires and navigating them together as a community. And that's what I love about BDA Baby. So thanks for welcoming me back.